in some ways. There are a couple of flagship projects. I mean, things, the fact that Linux really took off in the early 90s, that got me interested, I guess, in open source whenever, probably by sort of 95. Just a few successes.
You seem very cheerful and optimistic about this, but as someone who works on malware and bad guys on the internet, I remember when we thought the internet would bring out the best in all of us, and interesting how it hasn't quite happened that way. So what do you think about gray goo and evil geniuses and that cluster of bad possibilities?
Yeah. So if I can sort of broaden the question, what do you do about internet trolls of all types, whether they're organized or just doing it for kicks or whatever? And of course, it's a great question. If you have a completely open forum, it's difficult to defend against that. And so the natural kind of thing to do, you're trying to balance between the sort of openness that's necessary for these large-scale collaborations to occur against the damaging effects. Personally, so when you're talking about malware, of course, well, what do I want to say? Okay, so actually, that's a really good concrete example. So what do you do about people who decide that they want to use some of these parts to synthesize something which is really dangerous? And the honest answer, as far as I can tell, I'm not an open source biologist. I watch this, that particular stuff, is that they're not sure. It is interesting that the leading people like Drew Endy is certainly one in open source biology, think a lot about that. They have sensible sounding things to say, but I suspect that the community is not yet large enough of people doing this. It's on the order of hundreds or thousands of people. Once you really, I want to see it tested. If you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people doing it, they have this DIY bio, which is basically sort of doing it in your garage because it's cheap enough you can do it in your garage. Once that's not sort of a few dozen people in the Bay Area and in Boston, but is rather thousands or tens of thousands of people around the world, what we'll actually see, I don't know. So it's a really good question.
And they all dump it down the sink and float to
yeah.
Psychologists have identified a phenomenon they call crowding out, where if you have a community of people voluntarily contributing to some kind of commons, and then you introduce a system of incentives to make some contributions to the commons, it tends to kill off other contributions that aren't specifically the ones that are awarded. And so I guess the question that leads to is, what does a tenure and promotion system look like if it's going to exist alongside this very low-level open kind of collaboration, and does it even make sense? Like, could we have a tenure and promotion system alongside, an environment where all your basic ideas get posted on a wiki and then pursued by other people?
Okay, I'm not sure that question was necessarily audible to everybody. I'll take the liberty of repeating it, which is, what happens to the tenure and promotion system for academics under this kind of environment? Is that a fair paraphrase? There are two separate things I think to say here. One is, at the very top level, people are assessed in very sort of non-standard ways. So actually a good example is Perelman and this proof of the Poincare conjecture, which he didn't submit for publication anywhere, he didn't do anything like that, and he was awarded and refused, in fact, the Fields Medal for that. So they couldn't care less in what format it came. If he'd sort of sent it on postcards from Russia, that would have been okay if it had been a good proof. But of course, it's sort of industrialized. You have this sort of scientific industrial complex at tens of thousands of institutions all over the world, or many thousands of institutions all over the world, and they don't do things in that kind of one-off way where they deeply assess people's work. Instead, there's a lot of sort of bean counting tends to go on. How many citations does the person have? These kinds of things. And of course, that potentially changes here, and you have a lag in time. So there are people writing wonderful blog posts. Do they necessarily get credit for it? This is sort of the type of question what you're interested in. The only thing that can be done there, in some sense, is to wait to see people start to catch up. So organisations like the Public Library of Science are very aggressively exploring the idea of starting to provide in a systematic way. We're at time, starting to provide in a systematic way metrics which measure impact on blogs and all these other kinds of things. So once you start to measure, people start to respond. There's a time lag, however. If there's really a big advantage to doing things in this way, if people are really building great tools, though, of course that to some extent compensates for that time lag. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. That's not a very good answer, but I'd be interested to chat later. Okay, and I'm being told that is time.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's time. I have to announce that Henk de Vries' talk is cancelled and it's replaced by Peter Style from Coreboot. We will have more information in a few minutes.
Thank you all.